Cincinnati Bengals defensive end Trey Hendrickson requested a trade, and the coach who drafted Trey Hendrickson into the NFL, Chicago Bears defensive coordinator Dennis Allen. Could he be the solution to the Bears' pass rusher void? Well, if he is, it's going to be expensive.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to learn more. On the show today, we look at the upcoming pass rusher, edge rusher, defensive end market for the Chicago Bears. Trey Hendrickson now receiving permission to seek a trade, some natural ties to Chicago, a need there, some cap space here, some familiarity there, but also what that would cost, not only from a trade standpoint, but also a contract extension standpoint. He is going to be expensive, and whether that aligns with exactly where the Bears are right now, well, we'll explore that, and then what the other defensive end options might be, including some salary cap casualties from other teams, at least creating some more options for the Bears to consider here. And if we got time at the end, we'll take a look at the tight end the Bears signed as a cap casualty, Durham Smythe from the Miami Dolphins, and some other roster moves the Bears made kind of a little bit under the radar this week. But as soon as it's reported that the Cincinnati Bengals are giving Trey Hendrickson permission to seek a trade with other teams, Chicago Bears fans light up. I think Bears fans were already interested in Trey Hendrickson as a potential trade target, but we weren't sure, okay, are the Bengals actually going to budge on a trade there? Is that very realistic? Or are they going to try and re-sign him and keep him around? Because the Bengals have had really struggled on defense this past season and are trying not to bleed so much talent from that side of the ball, but whoops, looks like they're not going to be able to afford to keep Trey Hendrickson around either. So now they're open for business, and the Bears are obviously a natural landing spot here. Other teams who have expressed interest reportedly include the Washington Commanders, and I believe I saw the Atlanta Falcons are also in that conversation, but it makes, you can connect a lot of the dots for the Bears because of Dennis Allen. Trey Hendrickson was drafted by the New Orleans Saints when Dennis Allen was the defensive coordinator there. Of course, he then left the Saints and went to the Bengals on a big contract and spent the last 4 years there, making the Pro Bowl in each of the last 4 years. And in each of the last 2 seasons, he's had 17 and a half sacks that led the NFL this season. No one is sacking the quarterback more than Trey Hendrickson, and his pressure numbers are top 5 in the NFL. His PFF numbers are top 5 in the NFL. He has been an elite pass rusher in the last handful of seasons here. He has 4 different seasons, over 13 sacks in the NFL. He's been durable. He's been productive. He is a bona fide top-notch pass rusher in football. The Bears, of course, have a vacancy at a starting defensive end spot opposite Montez Sweat now that they released DeMarcus Walker as their own salary cap casualty. And so, put 2 and 2 together, a reunion in Chicago could make sense for both parties. Now, where this becomes more challenging is how much draft capital the Bears might have to give up in order to get him in a trade. And then if you're trading for Trey Hendrickson, you're trading for the right or privilege to give him a contract extension. And part of what him getting permission to seek a trade means is that he can negotiate with the Bears on that contract extension before a trade is finalized. So there's some flexibility there, or some assurance there, that you could figure out the contract details and then do the trade, as opposed to trading for a guy and trying to figure out the contract next. But his cap hit this season is $18.66 million. He is seeking a contract reportedly worth at least $30 million a year. $30 million a year. And that is a lot of money for any player, let alone a non-quarterback. But as far as like pass rushers go, it would make him the highest paid pass rusher in the NFL, depending on how high that number above 30 million goes. If you look at some of the other top salaries in the NFL, Max Crosby just reset the market by getting a deal worth $35.5 million. Hendrickson is probably using that Max Crosby contract as a template to say, okay, Crosby just got 35.5, so I want something comparable to that for me, being Trey Hendrickson. The difference is Crosby's a little bit younger, and I also think while Crosby didn't necessarily have 17 and a half sacks this season, Hendrickson has kind of had the sack lead in him. He still had 14 and a half last season, 7.5 this season while he was injured. Crosby is more of a well-rounded player. And I think as much as we get caught up in Trey Hendrickson's sacks and pass rushing numbers, he is not nearly as good as a run defender as the likes of Max Crosby and even Nick Bosa, who also has a $34 million a year contract with the San Francisco 49ers. So I think someone like Hendrickson slots in a little bit below those two guys. He's in the $30 to $34 million range, but not above Crosby and Nick Bosa at that point, but clearly ahead of, like, the next highest paid guys are all around $28 million. Josh Allen Hines, Brian Burns, TJ Watt are all 28 and change on their contract. So that's kind of the range where I think someone like Hendrickson slots in. And I think the Bears have to ask themselves, okay, are we willing to put over $50 million into two defensive ends? Because Montez Sweat currently is the 7th highest paid edge rusher in the NFL. So you could have essentially the 3rd highest paid edge rusher and the 7th highest paid edge rusher in football, and that's going to eat a lot of your salary cap space. If you trade for Trey Hendrickson, you're not going to be able to afford Atlanta Falcons center Drew Dahlman on a big contract. If you trade for Trey Hendrickson, that's the last of the big deals you can make. It's going to have to be a cheaper center or just a rookie, a cheaper wide receiver or just a rookie, a cheaper, I guess they just signed a tight end, so that comes out of the way. But like everything else kind of goes out the window as far as big moves go, because whether it's Hendrickson or not, like the edge rusher market has elevated due to largely Crosby getting this contract, but then Bosa having the contract before him. Then you add in the draft capital. It's going to cost draft picks to get Trey Hendrickson to the Chicago Bears. What exactly that rate looks like is hard to pin down exactly. I don't think it costs as much as the Bears had to give up to get Khalil Mack, all those years ago at 2018, because when they traded for Khalil Mack, he was at the time 27 years old, entering the prime of his career. Trey Hendrickson is not old, but he isn't 27. He is 30, just turned 30 in December. And so, how many more years of that? It just decreases his value a little bit more. I think the template I look for is kind of the Von Miller trade from a couple of seasons ago when he went to the Buffalo Bills, or I don't even know, it was 2 years ago now, from the Rams to the Bills on a nice little deal there that obviously when you're trying to go all in to win a Super Bowl, that can be a big move here. But at the same time, it was when he went from the Broncos to the Rams and then ended up going to the Bills after that. When he went to the Rams, it was a 2nd and 3rd round pick for Von Miller in that trade. Another player who was closer to this age range with a similar kind of productivity. I think that's the negotiating point. It's like a 2nd and a 3rd round pick. Maybe the Bengals want a little bit more than that, or maybe they end up at a little less than that, but I think that's sort of the starting point. 2nd round pick plus another premium pick, or maybe you do some kind of pick swap in there. But I guess from a Chicago Bears perspective, do you want to give up not only all of your important cap space if you trade for Hendrickson, you're not really signing any other big name free agents. It's all cheap guys from there. And then also give up 2 of your rookies that you also get to add to your roster, right? It's not just taking away free agent opportunities, but then it's taking away NFL draft opportunities, where if you give up, say, 1 of your 2nd round picks and your 3rd round pick this season, then the Bears will be left with just a 1st and a 2nd, and then you wouldn't pick again until the 5th round. So then you have a smaller draft class, fewer opportunities with those draft picks to get young offensive linemen, to get young defensive linemen, to add more depth at receiver, at linebacker, in the secondary, get a safety of the future, right? Like, it becomes more and more challenging. And so I think the question for the Bears is, how much are you all in on this year? Because how many years of Trey Hendrickson are you going to get at a high level? You're giving him a 3-year contract. He's 30 now, so you'll get his age 30 season. 31, he's probably still going to be pretty good. Is 32 when the play starts to decline a little bit, and then 33 is when things really drop off? Are you trying to hit that window right now, this year, and say, hey, we're sacrificing the long-term future of our team by missing out on these draft picks that you can develop and build sort of the bottom end of your roster? That's the really difficult spot for the Bears, and where it feels to me like it doesn't necessarily align with where the Bears are exactly right now, that they still have an eye to the future in addition to improving in the present. And I wouldn't count on a Trey Hendrickson trade happening, but with Ben Johnson and company in the fold, the Bears have been willing to be more aggressive, and you never know what might happen there. But there's a lot of other options they could use to upgrade defensive end and the pass rush. And we'll look at what that looks like on the free agent market and what those price tags could be comparatively and how that sort of shapes the Trey Hendrickson decision next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. When the game tips off, that's when the NBA action is only getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss that opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can always stay in on the action. If you're looking for an even bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. It just helps keep every moment of the game exciting. Whether you want to back that late-game rally or pick a player to hit a clutch three-pointer, you're never going to feel like you missed your chance, and the app is super easy to use. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Trey Hendrickson is clearly the best pass rusher the Chicago Bears would have available to them this offseason. Better than any of the free agent players that became available. He's also going to be the most expensive financially and the most expensive from a draft capital standpoint. And so it's not like your choice is Trey Hendrickson or nothing. It's, do you give up all that for Trey Hendrickson, or do you give up something less in terms of money and obviously no draft picks for a free agent to get a pass rusher who's obviously not going to be as good as Trey Hendrickson, but it's sort of like at a lower cost? Does that align better? Does it still give you the pass rusher you need, who's not as great, but aligns better with resource allocation of salary cap space, right? Could you sign a pass rusher in free agency that's cheaper, that then still leaves you with the money to sign a free agent center, or to sign a better number 3 wide receiver, or to sign a better kick returner, or a running back? Like, it's not just pass rusher versus pass rusher, but it's Hendrickson versus pass rusher plus everything else, plus the picks you don't have to give up to get a player like that. And I think the good news for the Bears is that we're seeing other teams make salary cap decisions that have added more free agent options to the pool. The bad news is that when whoever trades for Hendrickson and gives him a new contract, it's going to raise everybody's price tag. Just like Max Crosby is going to raise all these free agent price tags. But it is a supply and demand game at the end of the day. And as more supply is included, then that helps lower the price for the teams in demand, like the Chicago Bears. And so, while it's easy to get excited about Hendrickson, there's other options you can like that won't cost draft picks and won't quite cost $30 million. Because, again, when you think about like the biggest pass rusher contracts, last offseason, Danielle Hunter got $24.5 million. I think he got the biggest free agent defensive end contract, basically the same thing Montez Sweat got. So your free agents are not going to come in at this $30+ million a year number. Those kind of players don't hit free agency. They, at best, you end up trading for them because they're too valuable to let go. That becomes a little bit more affordable for the Bears if you're talking more in like the under 25, in a lot of cases under 20, closer to 15 and even lower numbers for lesser free agents. That becomes more affordable, and you have to ask yourself, like, do the Bears need a Trey Hendrickson level pass rusher, or could they be really good with someone like, Chase Young is a name that has come up a lot throughout this offseason, but there's a bunch of different free agent pass rushers available, and 2 more that were added to the mix. Joey Bosa was released by the Los Angeles Chargers as a salary cap casualty, and former Chicago Bears free agent target Dre'Mont Jones was released by the Seattle Seahawks as a salary cap casualty for both of those teams. And so now you look at the free agent market, and you can find a good dozen, at least, starting caliber defensive ends that could fit in Chicago. Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Josh Sweat, Dre'Mont Jones, DeMarcus Lawrence, Hassan Reddick, Chase Young, Malcolm Kuntz, Dante Fowler, Chauncey Golston, Deo Odebayo from the Indianapolis Colts, and the list keeps going on beyond those guys. Like, there are a lot of decent options out there. And so the Bears aren't going to feel this pressure like, oh, we got to get Trey Hendrickson or else we're not going to be able to get our guy. Now, if the price was right, I think the Bears will absolutely consider this and explore what that might cost them. But I still feel like Ryan Poles, he made his big pass rusher splash in Montez Sweat. That was his swing for the fences, get a guy and lock him in, give up a draft pick and a big contract for him. And you got to spread the investment across the roster. Now he's spreading that investment into the offensive line. Last year, we saw him spread that investment at wide receiver with a first-round pick and a big trade for Keenan Allen. Like, I don't know that he's got another big pass rusher trade in him. But if you could get someone like Chauncey Golston from Dallas, who worked with Al Harris in Dallas for half of the price of Trey Hendrickson, like, that can be a smarter long-term investment, especially when you think about the NFL draft and being able to get a pass rusher there that can then rotate in and not having to invest a second and a third round pick and all your cap space in one player. You could get a pass rusher like Golston and then still have a first, 2 seconds, and a third to get more offensive linemen, to get more pass rushers, to get skill position players. And some of these less expensive pass rushers comparatively leave you with more salary cap space to go get other guys. And I think across the board here, you can find a lot of different pass rushers to like. I particularly want to throw out Dre'Mont Jones again as someone that the Bears pursued him when he was a free agent back in, 2023, just 2 years ago? It was the same offseason that the Bears were going after Dre'Mont Jones. There was Zach Allen. The Cardinals ended up going to the Broncos. Javon Hargrave goes from the Eagles to the 49ers. And the Bears were kind of talking all these guys. They end up signing DeMarcus Walker instead at a much cheaper price, and later Yannick Ngakoue in that same offseason. But Dre'Mont Jones had left Denver, went to Seattle for 2 seasons, and didn't do so well over there, and is now back on the free agent market, and maybe, certainly a heck of a lot cheaper than he was back then. And Dre'Mont Jones is interesting because he's kind of built in this big defensive end mold that someone like Dennis Allen might like here. The Seahawks tried to make him an edge rusher later on, but he's like 280 pounds. Like, that's the Cam Jordan style of mold. For a lot of teams, he's going to be a defensive tackle on the interior, and he's a guy who you certainly can play at a bunch of different spots up front, and I think he would be a fun scheme fit as a chess piece to kind of play that DeMarcus Walker role in Chicago, but hopefully a player who can be a bit more productive than what DeMarcus Walker was able to do here. Because we've seen Dre'Mont Jones be, a pretty consistent 5 to 6 sack guy earlier in his career. He's pretty strong against the run as well. And if you can bring that price tag much, much lower than it was when he went to Seattle, like I still think there's some meat on that bone that the Bears could go after here and get him at a much better price the second time around here and fit that style of scheme. It's not the 17.5 sacks that Trey Hendrickson presents, but I guess the question is, do the Bears need 17.5 sacks? It's nice. Every team could always use 17.5 sacks. But in order for this Bears defense to be good or even great, how many sacks do they need opposite of Montez Sweat? Like, if we really think about what's the minimum you need to get by there, is it 10? And does that 10 have to come from one player? Or can it be, you sign somebody like Golston or somebody like Dre'Mont Jones or Chase Young, whoever, and they give you 7 sacks this season. And say you draft a pass rusher in the second round and they give you 4 sacks off the bench. And then Austin Booker gives you 3 sacks off the bench. And all of a sudden, non-Montez Sweat defensive ends are giving you 14 sacks. And if Sweat can give you another 10 or 11 or something, all of a sudden, that's a fine pass rush in the NFL. You don't need, quote unquote, 17.5 sacks from Trey Hendrickson. It would be nice. And if you could afford it and the draft picks worked out and everything, absolutely. No one's saying Hendrickson wouldn't be good in Chicago, but it's sort of like luxury versus priority here. And I feel like I would rather invest that cap space and those draft picks in continuing to bolster the offensive line and the rest of the roster, as opposed to dumping everything into pass rusher and everything into another defensive end on the other side from Sweat. It's not fun. It's not as sexy. It's a little bit more boring, but I think that's the more prudent team building strategy. And I generally expect that will be the direction Ryan Poles ends up going in. In the meantime, he's still building out the rest of this Bears roster and making the moves to kind of piece together some of the depth spots that we talked about on yesterday's podcast, including a number 2 tight end brought into the fold, someone we've talked about here on Locked On Bears, and re-signing some key players on this roster that I think might signal some direction of where the Bears are going. So we'll check in. We'll get to know new Bears tight end Durham Smythe and also some of the big special teams decisions they made on the players they brought back next on Locked On Bears. Signing a number 2 tight end is never going to be a huge headline-grabbing move for the Bears, but given that Gerald Everett was such a kind of a splash signing with high expectations last offseason to be a number 2 tight end, before that Robert Tonyan had the potential to come in here and be a difference maker at the number 2 tight end, it's a spot that generally hasn't gone well for the Bears, and so we'll pay attention a little bit to who they bring in now with Durham Smythe coming from the Miami Dolphins, especially because in Detroit, Ben Johnson used quite a bit of 2 tight end sets. That number 2 tight end spot played a lot, even if in Detroit it wasn't a high-impact playmaker in the name of Brock Wright. And so when Durham Smythe comes in, I think right away we got to make sure our expectations are very low. Miami Dolphins fans, where Smythe was just released from, were not fans of Durham Smythe. He was largely disliked by Dolphins fans. They were happy to see him go, and they don't expect him to do anything of note with the Chicago Bears. Dolphins fans will tell you Smythe is slow. He doesn't get open very well, and he's not a very good blocker. And so you're kind of left wondering, well, what does he do well? And I think that's, fans disappointed by a player are always going to have a pretty negative light. And I think he's probably a little bit better than what Dolphins fans give him credit for. But at the same time, like his role on that team, he got beat out by an undrafted rookie free agent out of the University of Campbell. It's an FCS program there. And I think for Dolphins fans, that spoke a lot to like the lack of quality they were getting from Smythe. I think Smythe, actually, I'm not even positive I'm saying that name correctly now that I think about it, but he had a really bad 2024. But I think there was more to like in 2023 and 2022. And for those who don't know, the connection here as to what brings Durham Smythe to the Chicago Bears is that when Ben Johnson was on the Miami Dolphins as an offensive assistant, I think he was the wide receivers coach in 2018. That was Smythe's first year with the Dolphins. So they crossed over together for one season when the Dolphins drafted him in the 4th round out of Notre Dame. So there's a familiarity there, albeit it was 6 years ago now at this stage of the process, but still not a complete unknown player coming in here. You look at how the Dolphins used him. He was among the highest percentage of snaps used as a pass blocker in the NFL the last handful of seasons. They used him as a blocker quite a bit. Now, Dolphins fans will tell you maybe he wasn't very good at it, but that was his primary role there and something I would expect the Bears to do quite a bit with him on this team. He is going to do a lot of blocking, and we'll judge for ourselves at what quality that is. But for a number 2 tight end, like that's going to be a big part of the role, and certainly he at least has experience doing it at varying levels of success there. I also look back over his career. This is a guy who has very sure hands, or at least he did before 2024, but like over the course of his career, rarely dropped passes. In 2022 and 2023, he didn't drop a single pass all season. Now, he's not catching 100 balls, but he did go, back-to-back seasons with 35 catches in 2023 and 15 in 2024, like 50 catches in a row without dropping one. And I'm sure he only dropped one the year before that. So I'm sure there was a long streak of like consistently catching passes without dropping them. He has good hands, but to Dolphins fans' credit, he has forced one missed tackle in his 7-year career. He is not someone who's going to make a lot of plays after the catch, doesn't get a ton of yards after catch, not a guy who's going to be a dynamic playmaker in your offense. But we're talking about a number 2 tight end who could very well end up being a number 3 tight end if the Bears end up drafting a tight end or whatever they end up doing at that position. Like, this is not a player we need to have high expectations for. His career high was 366 receiving yards last season. He has 3 career touchdowns in 7 seasons. So this is not a unlock the offense playmaker. It's a guy you're familiar with who can do some blocking, can maybe do some special teams and help you out as a depth player on your team, who is not going to be very expensive for the Bears at this stage of the process. Speaking of special teams, though, real quick, the Bears re-signed and also tenured some different players of their own that were about to be free agents. They re-signed slot cornerback Josh Blackwell. They re-signed backup linebacker Eamon Ogbongbemiga. And then they gave exclusive rights tenders to offensive lineman Bill Murray and defensive end Daniel Hardy. And these moves all kind of came in fairly quick succession, and that shouldn't be surprising because if you look at last season, who were the Bears' 3 leading special teams tacklers? Daniel Hardy, Amen Ogbongbemiga, and Josh Blackwell. This was the Bears going to special teams coordinator Richard Hightower and saying, let's bring back your guys. Boom, boom, boom. Your guys are back. It's a big pay raise for Josh Blackwell, especially. Ogbongbemiga gets a little bit of a pay raise from the year before. Hardy's more of a tender, but like those guys are 3 core special teams players for Richard Hightower, and he got his guys back. Plus, I think Blackwell especially is still a very talented defensive player as well. It's valuable to have a player who's a backup in the slot. So if for some reason Kyler Gordon suffers an injury, you can trust Blackwell stepping in there in a short-term capacity. He's flashed some ability, and I like Josh Blackwell. I think it's worth keeping him around and developing him as a DB on the back end here. So like all 3 of those guys, special teamers, giving Richard Hightower's his guys. And I think from a thematic standpoint here, okay, they just got Richard Hightower 3 of his guys. Earlier this week, they trade for two offensive linemen and sign the tight end that Ben Johnson knows. They get Ben Johnson his guys. And so is it Dennis Allen's turn next to go get his guys? Who are they going to go get for Dennis Allen? It's probably going to be one of these pass rushers we've been talking about. Probably not Trey Hendrickson, but we'll see. Never say never. It's a new era in Chicago, and maybe Ryan Poles wants to swing for the fences here. Whatever the Bears decide to do from a defensive end perspective, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming back on Monday and make Locked On Bears your first listen again, because free agency is going to get rolling here. The so-called legal tampering period, the open negotiation period gets started, and then, and then you've got free agency actually opening on Wednesday, but Monday, I'm choking here. Monday is when you can start negotiating with contracts. Wednesday is when the new league year starts and the contracts actually become official. So it's going to be a whirlwind. The moves are going to come fast and furious, and we'll try to stay on top of them and break them all down for you as best we can here on Locked On Bears. That's why you got to subscribe. That's why you got to keep making us your first listen every day so you don't miss a thing. And in exchange, I'm sure you'll leave every episode with another opportunity to bear down.